What if I told you that two little girls in 1834 knew your secrets before you were even born? Eastern Kentucky, the morning mist doesn't just roll, it clings, like memory, like regret. This wasn't the Kentucky you learned about in school. This was something older, wilder, a place where time seemed to break. And the silence, it had teeth. Pine Hollow didn't exist on most maps. Not then, not now. What happened there was buried, deliberately. For nearly 200 years, only one record remained, a leather-bound journal discovered inside the rotted beams of a demolished church. The man who kept it, Pastor William Phillips, documented everything, every whispered confession, every impossible event, every moment he doubted his own sanity. The entry begins on November 15th, 1834. Three figures arrived in the cold dusk. A weathered preacher named Ezekiel Morrison and his 9-year-old twin daughters. They walked into a town that thought it had secrets and left behind a community broken by the truths those girls unearthed. This story is not folklore. It's recorded fact, verified, studied, feared. But here's what the historians won't tell you. Some knowledge doesn't just change how you think, it changes who you are. And once you hear what the twins revealed, there's no going back. The first thing the congregation noticed wasn't the preacher, it was the girls. Rebecca and Rachel. Identical in every way, but deeply different. Rebecca smiled like she knew you. Rachel stared like she remembered you. People said their eyes were too old, not haunted, aware, like they'd seen your worst memory, and decided to stay silent. For now, they were pale, too pale for children who'd traveled 50 miles on foot. Their boots were caked in mountain clay, but their dresses, white, clean, almost glowing in the candlelight, never seemed to get dirty. That night, the Morrisons were offered a small cabin beside the church. Nothing unusual, just hospitality. Until Rebecca, who had not yet entered the building, looked at the pastor's wife and said, "The roses by the eastern fence, they didn't die this year, not like 3 summers ago." Mrs. Phillips dropped her spoon. The blight that ruined her roses wasn't in any journal, wasn't spoken of in town. It was her memory. Private. Personal. Rebecca just smiled. "I dreamed them," she said, "and they dreamed me back." And that was the moment Pine Hollow realized. These girls weren't here to worship. They were here to reveal. The next morning, the wind howled like it had a voice. Pastor Phillips awoke before dawn, as always, but something was wrong. The fire had gone cold too quickly. The air felt watched. Ezekiel Morrison sat by the embers, unmoving. His Bible lay open, unread, his eyes fixed on something that wasn't there. "They had dreams," he said quietly, "darker than usual." Before the pastor could ask what he meant, Rebecca walked in, barefoot, silent. She looked directly at him and said, "Beneath the 3rd floorboard, under the altar, there's something you've hidden." Rachel dreamed it. I dreamed why. Phillips froze. No one knew about the bottle of whiskey hidden beneath that floorboard, wrapped in the cloth of his dead infant son's blanket. A weakness he confessed only to God. But Rachel joined her sister and whispered, "It was blue, the blanket. You kept it because it hurt too much to let go." The pastor sat down, not from belief, from collapse. These weren't parlor tricks. These weren't coincidences. Something ancient had followed these girls from birth, and it didn't speak with words. It spoke with knowing, and it had just opened the church floor. That Sunday sermon would be remembered long after Pine Hollow vanished from the maps. Ezekiel preached with fire, but that wasn't unusual. What happened after the sermon shattered the illusion of godly order the town had clung to for generations. The Morrison twins moved through the congregation in silence, like shadows disguised as children. Not a game, not mischief, revelation. Rebecca stopped before Samuel Turner, wealthy farmer, devout donor. "Mr. Turner," she said, "if you put the money back before next Sunday, does it still count as stealing?" Turner's face turned to ash. For 6 months, he'd been quietly taking from the offering plate to cover failed business debts. No one knew. Then Rachel stepped toward Martha Whitfield, the widow everyone respected. "Your husband didn't die in that accident, did he?" she asked. "You hide the letters he still sends you." Martha nearly fainted. Around the room, whispers turned to gasps, panic hiding behind piety. Each secret they spoke was deadly accurate. Rebecca called out adultery, Rachel exposed hidden children, Dr. Hayes' unlicensed surgeries, a mentally disabled boy locked in an attic for years. This wasn't gossip. This was judgment, delivered not by angels, but 2 little girls who saw everything. The congregation stood frozen. Mothers gripped their children tighter, men glanced at each other, pale with shared guilt. What these twins revealed was not just hidden sin, it was intimate decay, carefully concealed under faith and routine. But then Rebecca stepped forward. She walked slowly to the altar, where the wooden cross stood, a humble symbol carved by Pine Hollow's founders. She placed her tiny hand on it, calm, certain. "This is sacred ground," she said quietly. "But it's been stained. Something happened here. Something all of you buried." She turned to Pastor Phillips. "The Witman family. They didn't die in a house fire, did they?" The name hit the room like thunder. "They died right here, in this church. And some of you know exactly why." Gasps. One man dropped to his knees. Another clutched a pew like a lifeline. The Witmans were a founding family. Their death in a fire 16 years earlier was Pine Hollow's oldest scar, but Rebecca was not supposed to know about it. What she said next wasn't vague. It wasn't symbolic. It was detailed. The dresses the girls wore, where they hid, who found them. The church went silent, and the descent truly began. No one moved. Not even the wind outside dared to rustle the chapel's old timbers. Pastor Phillips stood at the pulpit, his knuckles white around the edges of the wood. Rebecca's words hung in the air like a curse, and Rachel, silent until now, added softly, "They didn't scream when they died. They knew it wouldn't matter." It wasn't said with cruelty. It was said like a child describing something she saw in a dream, but the effect was devastating. Elder Thompson, the oldest living member of the original settlement, slowly stood, his body shaking. He cleared his throat. "That night, we made decisions we thought would protect the town," he said, his voice cracking under weight not just of years, but of guilt. He didn't deny the accusation. He didn't challenge the girls. He confirmed it. Pastor Phillips could barely breathe. He remembered the whispers, fragments overheard as a boy, stories that stopped when he entered a room, elders who drank too much during winter vigils. He thought they were myths. Now he knew they were memory. And beneath the altar where he preached every week was not just holy ground. It was a grave. It had always been there. Right underfoot, right beneath the hymns, the baptisms, the weddings, and confessions. The dead weren't just buried beneath the church. The church was built to bury them. Elder Thompson's voice returned, hollow and grim. Jacob Witman knew things he shouldn't. Spoke of forces, not from God. He said the girls had dreams, visions, same as those two. He pointed at Rebecca and Rachel, but his hand trembled as though they were phantoms, not children. People got scared, said Mary was a witch, that she'd cursed the land. One night, when the snow came early and the firewood ran low, someone lit the wrong fire. The congregation didn't breathe, not a cough, not a murmur, just silence, and the sound of their entire worldview cracking beneath them. Mrs. Carter began to sob. Pastor Phillips looked at the girls, no longer children in his eyes. They were vessels of memory, mirrors of sin, and reminders that truth always returns, even if it has to speak through the mouths of the innocent. Rebecca stepped forward. They thought they were protecting the town, she said. But what they really did was bind the curse to the land. And in that moment, the floor creaked. Not from anyone moving, but from beneath. The sound was unmistakable, wood bending not from pressure above, but from something shifting below. Pastor Phillips froze. His mind raced. The foundation hadn't groaned like that in the 15 years he'd served this church. Not once, not during storms, not during funerals, never like this. Rachel's voice came again, calm, certain, and terrifying. "They don't rest well." Phillips stared at her. "Who?" he managed to whisper. "Hope and faith," she replied. "They weren't just killed. They were silenced." The pastor's breath caught. "Silenced how?" Rebecca answered now. Her tone was no longer a child's. It was something ancient speaking through her skin. Their mouths were filled with ashes, their lungs with smoke. Their last words were never heard. Silence fell again, but it wasn't empty. It was listening. Then, a knock. From beneath the floorboards. One knock. Then two. Then silence. Elder Thompson collapsed onto the pew. He began to weep. "We buried them alive," he gasped. "Sweet God in heaven. We buried them alive." But Rachel shook her head. "No, not heaven. God didn't watch this place that night." And just then, the lamps flickered. Not from wind, but from something remembering. There's a reason the wooden cross above the altar always seemed darker at its base. Not from age, not from weather, but from blood, scrubbed, sanded, concealed. Rachel approached it slowly, placing her palm on the base. "It's still warm," she whispered. Pastor Phillips felt the ground tilt beneath him. The others remained frozen like statues in a sacred tomb. "This is where it happened," Rebecca said, her voice hollow. "Where faith tried to hide behind her mother's skirts. Where hope begged with eyes wide open, but lips sealed shut. And where Mary Witman," she paused. Everyone leaned in, "was strangled, not burned, not in her home. Right here, where you now ask God for mercy." Dr. Hayes staggered back. That's not in any record." Rebecca looked at him, eyes like winter glass. "Because you don't record sins, you bury them." At that moment, a floorboard behind the altar creaked open slightly, by no visible force. From the darkness below rose the faint scent of roses and rot. Rachel looked directly at Pastor Phillips. "Truth isn't buried forever. It waits, beneath pulpits, behind prayers, inside guilt." And as if summoned by her words, something moved beneath the floor again. This time, it was closer. The congregation stood paralyzed. No wind, no breath, no motion, except the gentle, rhythmic shifting of the floorboards behind the altar. Pastor Phillips stepped forward, trembling. With hesitant hands, he removed the cross from its stand. Then, slowly, he knelt. The twins didn't flinch. They simply watched. He pried at the warped third board, the one Rebecca had mentioned their first morning in Pine Hollow. It lifted with a sickening groan. Inside was not just the bottle of whiskey. There was something else. Wrapped in the shredded remains of what appeared to be a blue lace bonnet, lay a small, decayed wooden doll, scorched down its left side, a thin splinter of silver tangled in its yarn hair. Hope's doll. The same one Rebecca described, that hadn't been seen in over 16 years. Phillips fell back, white as ash. Elder Thompson knelt beside him. "God help us." They were telling the truth. Rebecca turned to the congregation, voice sharper now, not a child's, but something older. "You didn't just bury the dead. You built your salvation on top of them." Rachel added softly, But the dead don't sleep when justice is undone. Outside, thunder cracked, yet the skies had been clear. Something had awakened, and it wasn't done yet. The air inside the church turned heavy, like the weight of buried guilt pressing down from above. Some of the congregation fled. Others stood frozen in place, unable to look away from the twins or the gaping hole beneath the altar. Rebecca and Rachel stepped forward again, this time not as children, but as messengers, not of fear, but of reckoning. Rebecca's voice rang out, calm and ancient. This was not the only church built over silence. There are others, places like this, where truth was nailed beneath floorboards and the lie became the sermon. Rachel looked at the remaining elders. And you remembered. You just never spoke. Elder Thompson began to weep, not from guilt, but from relief. He spoke words he had carried for decades. We were told they were witches, that they'd cursed the crops, that the twins weren't natural. They said if we didn't act, Pine Hollow would burn. So we let it happen. We stood in silence as men we trusted sealed the church doors from the outside and struck the match. No one interrupted. No one denied. They had called it salvation, but all it was murder, sanctified by fear. And now fear had returned, not to punish, but to expose. Pastor Phillips collapsed to his knees beneath the altar, trembling, not in prayer, but in realization. All these years he'd preached above a grave. The foundations of Pine Hollow were not stone, but sin. Rachel knelt beside him, her tiny hand brushing the worn wood of the altar. Their voices never stopped. You just stopped listening. She turned to the congregation. And now, they want to be heard. The wind outside howled, but inside, the church stood deathly still. Then, a sound. A low, groaning creak from beneath the floorboards. One by one, nails began to rise. Wood strained, and the altar itself split down the center, revealing a narrow cavity filled with damp earth and the fragments of buried innocence. 2 small shoes, a charred doll, a locket crusted with soot. Sister Mary, the midwife, gasped and whispered, "Those are hope and faiths." She never finished the sentence. The congregation began to weep, not from grief, but release. Because the truth, even in horror, sets something free. That night, no one returned to the church. The following morning, only ashes remained, as if the building had chosen to burn rather than carry the weight any longer. The twins never spoke of it again. They left Pine Hollow at dawn. Ezekiel, hollow-eyed, the twins, silent. No one stopped them. No one said goodbye. The townsfolk simply watched from behind curtains, too afraid to ask questions, too ashamed to offer answers. And as the Morrison family disappeared into the misted hills, Pine Hollow quietly erased them. Within weeks, the congregation disbanded. The cemetery overgrew. The town shriveled like fruit left too long on the vine. But the curse, if that's what it was, didn't vanish with them. It followed the twins. Everywhere they went, the same pattern unfolded. First came the dreams, then came the truths, ripping through communities like wildfire. In a village near the Ohio border, a young bride screamed when Rachel described her secret plan to poison her husband. In Tennessee, Rebecca asked a retired judge why he still wore his war medal, the one he stole from a dead boy during a massacre no one reported. And in Georgia, the twins sat quietly in a pew as a preacher sobbed his sins aloud, before they ever spoke a word. It wasn't a gift, it was a reckoning. A mirror too pure for lies to survive. They didn't expose sins, they exposed what sin becomes when buried too long. By 1836, whispers of the twins had reached men in rooms without windows, men who didn't wear collars, but badges, buttons, and seals. One letter, dated June 3, 1836, from a U.S. Marshal in Lexington to a Washington official reads, "The Morrison children do not deceive, they reveal. And what they reveal weakens men of standing, causes suicides, and disrupts the peace of the frontier. I recommend quiet observation and strategic distancing." The government didn't try to understand them. They tried to contain the aftermath. By 1837, wherever the Morrison twins traveled, towns were flagged, mail delayed, journal entries confiscated. Locals warned not to speak of the preacher's daughters. Pastor Phillips's own journals, once thought lost, were found only in fragments, buried beneath insulation in a condemned seminary wall in 1987. And every surviving page shared a pattern. Each revelation they made was not just correct, but verifiable through documents the girls should never have accessed. Property deeds, court transcripts, midwife logs locked in churches for generations. They knew everything. And more frightening, they knew it before they arrived. Whatever they weren't merely human anymore. They had become something else. A breach. A wound in the veil. In February of 1838, the Morrison twins vanished. No burial records, no travel documents, no sightings in the Appalachian Circuit. It was as if they had never existed. Except, they did exist. Too many towns remember. Too many witnesses still whispered stories to their grandchildren. But the official narrative, carefully printed in 3 regional church newsletters, stated the following. The Morrison family was lost to fever during a winter crossing near the Lavisa Fork. No bodies recovered. Service held in absentia. Except Ezekiel's last journal entry, found decades later inside a sealed hymnal, says something else. Scrawled in shaky hand, it reads, "They came in the night, not men, but things in men's clothes, faces too smooth, voices too flat, said the girls were disrupting the design. I begged, they smiled, told me I had done well to bring them this far, and then they took them." The handwriting ends mid-sentence, and here's what chills to the marrow. In 1914, an elderly nurse in Pine Hollow described treating 2 silent girls who wandered into town, both around 9 years old. Identical, no parents, no names, and on the left shoulder of one, a birthmark. You think the story ends with their vanishing? No, that's when it begins. Because Pine Hollow wasn't the only place they were seen after 1838. In 1892, a photograph surfaced in a New Hampshire asylum, 2 identical girls standing behind a preacher's wife, their eyes blurred as if they moved during the exposure. In 1927, an Oklahoma schoolteacher described 2 mute twins who attended for only 3 days, then vanished. She quit teaching that same week, saying only, "They knew too much." And in 1971, a retired Kentucky pastor received a letter, no return address. Inside, a drawing of the Pine Hollow Church, and beneath it, a baby's blue blanket, stained with something dark. You were never supposed to know this, because those twins weren't just anomalies. They were interruptions in the control system, proof that some children can slip through the net, can remember what the rest of us are made to forget. So now you have a choice. If you followed this far, comment, "The pattern is cracked," twice. Because this story is more than history. It's a mirror. And now you're not on the outside looking in. You're inside the story. Welcome.